Hello everyone, this is Duan. Last week we talked about how you can implement cursor-based pagination in Apollo GraphQL project. And this week I want to go back to some of the basic elements in the Apollo client, specifically the useQuery hook that commonly being used, because I've seen a lot of problems people encounter when using the useQuery, specifically about how you can configure your cache, how you can configure fetch policies, and we're going to cover all of those in this video. Okay, I would like to talk about how the use query is being executed, what are the input, what are the output, when is it being fired. And next, I want to talk about how the data returned from the use query is cached in your in-memory cache, and then how you can actually update the cached query results using some of the methods provided by Apollo client, such as refetch, fetch more, and polling. And lastly, I want to talk about the fetched policy and what exactly do they mean. So this is probably the most common pattern you'll be seeing when implementing the use query hook in your project. So basically, at the bottom of the screen, you can see an example where the use query takes in a GraphQL query string, and it will return some state such as the loading and some information such as error and data from the server. This query actually resend the request every time the functional component that contains this hook re-renders. So watch out for state changes and prop changes in cases where you're not using cache, because it will actually send extra request whenever the component re-renders. So there are also additional input you can use to further customize query. So things like variables. If you've seen video from last week, we have a paginated query where it uses limit and cursor as custom variables. And you can also customize the how you want to update the cache using some of the methods provided by Apollo client, things like refetching and polling and fetch more. And lastly, you can do like fetch policies, so specify where you want your request to go, to the cache or to the server. There are also additional things that can be returned from this hook. So when you're doing the refetch, it will return a refetch callback where you can use in other part of your component. And you can also return some state, like network status, for example. It will tell you when you're trying to refetch something. So, assuming you're using the default setting of the Apollo client, every returned object will actually get cached in the in-memory cache, and it will do that in the following way. So first of all, it will generate a unique ID for every object that's being returned from the request. So the unique ID is composed in this way. It will use the underscore underscore type name, a column, the ID that returned from your data. So the underscore underscore type name is actually from the GraphQL schema you've defined. If you're using something like GraphQL CodeGen, then you probably don't know where this is coming from because it's actually generated automatically. Just be sure that you return the ID in your return data so that the Apollo client knows if this data is already in the cache or it's a new object that needs to be stored. Okay, once the data is being returned and the unique ID is being generated, it will store them in a flat lookup table. So every time you send another request, it will look at the unique ID. If it exists in the cache, it will just return the data very fast. It doesn't exist in the lookup table, it will send another network request to get the data and then store it in the cache if it returns the new data. So in scenarios where you have another query which returns the same object for some reason. For example, I'm getting top reviews. I'm also getting recent reviews, and some reviews might be the same. And in cases like that, the object with the same ID will be merged. It will actually not create a separate one because you don't want to have duplicates, right? I also have this assumption that the incoming data that from the request is the most updated one. So it will overwrite the existing data with the incoming data. And then if there are any field unique to the existing data or the incoming data, it will be merged together. So in this method, what you're technically doing is the object can be expanded, but it can never be reduced. You're not taking a field away from the object. So it can have some problems if you want to return an object that has less field than before, then it can cause problem because it actually doesn't change the existing data. So aside from the fetch more function we've mentioned last week when we're doing the paginated query, there are also methods such as polling and refetching, which you can update the cache query by sending requests directly to the server. So the polling and refetching doesn't actually look at the cache. It will directly send the network request to get the newest data from the server and update the cache. So polling is like setting up automatic update for your cache. You can specify the poll interval in your option object and specify the amount of milliseconds, how frequent you want to update the cache. So in the example above, you can see it will have a poll interval of 500 milliseconds. So this request will be sent to the server every 500 milliseconds to update the data. And same with refetching, it's very similar to polling, but instead, the useQuery returns a refetch callback, and this callback can be used anywhere in your component. So you can attach this callback to, for example, a button click. So you can click a button to update your cache, or you can even use it in your useEffect hook. It will do a refetch when a state changes, for example, and it's definitely very handy. So the last thing I would like to talk about is the fetch policies. So the fetch policies determines where your query is going to go. So is it going to read the cache first, or is it going to interact with the server? So by default, the fetch policy for Apollo client is the cache first. So what it means is that the query will look at the cache, cache the data first. If the cache doesn't have all the fields you need, it will send a network request to get the data from the server. And when the server returns the data, it will store the response to the cache, basically updating the cache. As you can imagine, if fetch policy is cache only, then your query will only look at the cache and it will never send network request to the server. So whenever your cache don't have all the fields that it needs, then it will throw an error. It will not send a network request. And then the cache and network, as you can expect, it will actually query against both the cache and the network. And when the data returns, it will update the cache. For network only, so it works like this. Whenever the query is sent, the query will go directly to the server. But when the data is being returned from the server, it will still store it in the cache. And lastly, the no cache, you are querying to the server and the response will not get stored in the cache. And that's everything you need to know about useQuery. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more related content, make sure you like and subscribe. If you have any questions with regards to useQuery in Apollo client, just leave a comment below and I will definitely answer it. I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.